Welcome everyone to our October 28th Cardea Users Group meeting. We're glad to have everyone here. This is held under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation's Public Health Initiative, and therefore we adhere to the Linux Foundation antitrust policy. The particulars are listed in the URL found in the meeting minute notes. So if you want more details, but basically we're not allowed to discuss pricing or specific business opportunities, things like that. If you have any questions, read the policy in detail. If you have further questions, contact the lawyer listed in the policy at the Linux Foundation antitrust policy. Cardea Code of Conduct is adhered to during our meetings, which means that everyone is welcome and that everyone has a voice. Please be nice to others, and then we'll all get along well. Would anyone like to introduce themselves today? I don't see any unfamiliar names on the list, so I won't even give it a full quarter Nathan. We'll just, anyone wants to go? One, going twice, going thrice. All right, today's topic for our exciting discussion is derivative credentials. And in order to talk about that, I wanted to cover at least 3 areas. I wanted to go over some of the Good Health Pass principles that they've kind of outlined in terms of good and ideal circumstances. Good Health Pass is sometimes a little further out than reality, but they do outline some good principles that could be should be considered as we try to talk about the subject of derivative credentials. Does everybody know what a derivative credential is in the first place? So a derivative credential, for those of you who don't know, is when you take a credential that's in some format. It could either be a verifiable credential, in which case you probably don't need a derivative credential. It could be in the form of a certificate, a signed certificate. It could be in the form of a piece of paper or a PDF, and then using that information that's there and whatever level of trust you have in the issuer of that piece of paper or that signed certificate, making an evaluation and issuing a verifiable credential that states that whoever evaluated it is certifying that they did whatever level of verification on the data that was presented to them, and then is issued a credential based on that. So that's kind of what a derivative credential is. And in order to deal with this topic, the reason we want to deal with this topic is there's such a wide variety of mechanisms for people getting test results or vaccinations or other types of health assessments. Some of them are self-attested, some of them are attested to by organizations who administer a test or a vaccination and then issue some kind of data about that. So I'd like to flip over to our the Good Health Pass and go to a couple of sections that I think are interesting to look at in terms of where they think credentialing ecosystems are today and may be in the future, so that we can look at other places that we might need to integrate with. So the list here on page 11 of the Good Health Pass recommendation outlines a number of credentialing ecosystems and specifications that are in the world today. So I think most people are familiar with the digital COVID certificates, that's abbreviated as DCC, issued by the European Union and other nations who have signed up to be part of that initiative. Not all of the nations are technically in the EU, but they're the kind of the governing body and are making the rules for how that system operates. So the member states, the issuing authorities in the DCC are governments, and they're the ones that are vetted by the EU and allowed to issue those cryptographically signed credentials and put them in a QR format so that they can be scanned and verified. Currently, the only, I don't know whether it's happened or not, but initially the only verifiers allowed were sovereign governments. So they were the only ones who were allowed to have access to the APIs to do the verification. There's been discussion of the EU opening those verification mechanisms to non-state participants to allow for broader verification to occur. So that's one source of credentials that is a large source and therefore a good candidate for us to consider. Are there any questions or discussions about the DCC as promulgated by the European Union? Okay.
So are those verifiable credentials, or are those using some other system?
They are not verifiable credentials. They are
So it's like stored in a database.
You're looking up something in a centralized database and being able to verify the signature of the signing country. And basically you're just saying that the signature is valid, therefore the entire contents are were signed by one of the sovereign participating states. It does have no mechanism for selective disclosure nor predicate proofs, but it is a digital mechanism. It's usually not a complete paper system. It's able to be processed digitally. So it's they have that.
That would help us make a derivative credential from it, where there's at least some level of trust in the original source of data, and verifiable credentials can improve on that.
Yeah, it's at least as strong. It's no stronger than, but at least as strong as what the EU has specified for the member states to do and how well they adhere to that. But it's within the EU in particular, it's a well-recognized mechanism for international travel and is in production at scale inside of the EU right now. So that's another consideration, is it's not something that people are talking about, it's something that they've already done. There are many in the EU community who recognize that there's it lacks privacy preservation considerations that would be more desirable, and it lacks some of the other interoperability that would be desirable from a verifiable credential. But it is what it is, and other questions or comments? So one of the other considerations for the DCC is that it's not available for non-sovereign states at this point in time, and is not recommended for use domestically. So if you're going to a sports venue or traveling within the country, a flight that originates and ends inside of France, for instance, they are not recommending the use of the DCC for those purposes. So it's being recommended for international travel only, and many of the internal use cases, the domestic use cases, are not addressed by this particular solution. So
Ken, I don't know if you wouldn't have an insight on this, but is part of that limitation due to the fact that it is a centralized solution and has some capacity and bandwidth limitations?
I don't know that that's particularly the problem. It's just that they've designated for a specific purpose, and originally they only allowed sovereign states to verify, and the governments within the EU some of them are chafing at the lack of selective disclosure and other features that would make for a better and stronger solution. Governments have the right to ask for all of your data. So selective disclosure is less of an issue with a government because they can demand all of it. But the restaurant probably doesn't need to know your whole health history, and therefore it shouldn't be shared with the restaurant. The maitre d' doesn't need to know whether you had a COVID test or whether you had a vaccine. All they need to know is that you're safe.
Got it. So it's probably, and we're speculating, just to be very clear, it's probably because of those shortcomings in privacy areas that it shouldn't be used more widely.
It may have also considerations for scaling, but that's not the primary chafing point with people who are recommending enhancements to or further work on the EU's solution. The EU itself has recognized that if this is a long-term problem and they want to do something long-term, that this is not an ideal solution. It was something they could put together very rapidly. But this is a source of a lot of credentials. All of the European nations have these as available for international travel purposes. So kind of a broad category.
Yeah, Ken, this is Jim. I would just add that this exact issue came up in our conversation with IATA. Or actually, not just our conversation with IATA where it did come up, but just watching the VCI forum they held a couple hours ago. They had the CIO for New York State Department of Health, and he specifically said the reason they moved off of IBM's Health Pass to this phase 2, which is smart health cards, is because other countries were demanding more vaccination information. But that runs immediately afoul of why IBM did Health Pass in the first place, which was simply a verifiable selective disclosure presentation that either said, yes, I am, or no, I'm not, which is, of course, what the airlines and restaurants and the like want because they don't want health information.
Yeah. So there's a tension between the requirements of sovereign states and the requirements of travel, airlines, airports, and particularly the off airport, where they have even less desire to have full information at the sports venues and hospitality type of locations. So kind of a tension also between the Europeans' GDPR requirements and DCC. So there is motivation to either enhance or change the protocol that they're using to have better privacy preservation while still having broad general deployment and the usefulness of the credential. The next one up on these are all listed by the Good Health Pass as potential ecosystems. The digital documentation of COVID certificates published by the World Health Organization. I have less familiarity with this one. Does anyone want to comment on this one as a target of potential inclusion for Cardea?
I'm sorry, Ken, you were asking about DIVOC specifically?
The DDCC, the World Health Organization's.
Oh, DVCC, I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah. Anyone?
Yeah, I don't even know where it's getting momentum.
So that one's less well known to me, and it may be that it's because I'm ignorant on the subject, but with nothing authoritative to say about this topic, let's move on to the next one. VCI, or the Vaccination Credential Initiative, and the smart health cards is kind of the core of that. This one does have a fairly, particularly in the United States, a fair number of states have adopted this as a technology for publishing, in particular, the vaccination information. I don't know if it's being used as extensively for the test results technology. Anyone want to comment on this one?
Yeah, so the heart of this is the HL7 Smart Health Card Standard, which everyone wants to call a standard, and it's just been voted through DSTU. there is, in my opinion, definitely a Cardea role here. I will offer to you that we're going to take a broader strategic approach with LFPH around VCI and smart health cards. California open sourced their implementation in GitHub. As of this morning, they were all cheery and giddy because there are 5 states who have adopted it. And Rick Cloud from California was saying that a 6th state is in stealth mode and will announce it shortly based on California's open source platform. You know, to your point, it does not have. There was a discussion. One of the sessions this morning was on trust frameworks as such. Nothing that in my mind represents the maturity of what the folks on this call talk about. So there is an angle to be taken. That angle may come. That angle will not go. Will not be directly with VCI. I will not have conversations with VCI anymore. But it may come in collaboration with California, who we reached out to, and I think that their open source implementation might be the yardstick for others. We also intend to follow up with IRA. I've talked to IRA in the past in my previous capacity, and think that IRA may be an angle to leverage, and then maybe just some other states. So it's going to have to be a multi-vector approach to the VCI smart health card implementation, mainly because there's just such a socio-cultural lack of consideration of the principles of selective disclosure as part of what they're doing. And they openly applaud, look, you can share your smart health card anywhere. There was more talk today about verifiers. They've got a verifier mobile app. They're rolling out a web-based verifier app. There's been no discussion, and it was interesting having talked to IATA this morning about relationships between the smart health card and international travel, other than saying, well, other countries want it. Yeah, but as you've just pointed out, Ken, what about this friction in terms of rules engines and machine readable governance between a smart health card that your state health agency gives you, what a foreign country is expecting, and an airline in between that says, I don't want to touch any of that stuff. And that is, as with many things in VCI, being glossed over in the name of unicorns and rainbows. So.
Can we get the unicorns and rainbows into the
I was gonna say the same thing. Is that an official technical assessment?
It is the official position of the executive director that it's unicorns and rainbows without question.
So what I'm hearing is that even with a standard for what VCI is capable of doing, that the implementations are not uniform. Is that correct, or am I misreading that?
There's uniformity in the implementation of the smart health card standard itself. There is nothing close to uniformity in terms of a ecosystem trust framework and corresponding machine readable governance. And the concept more broadly of an ecosystem of ecosystems, which is public health agency to individual, CVS to individual, individual to airlines, airlines to country, individual to country.
Okay. So
that's unicorns and rainbows, to be blunt. So yeah.
So my feeling is that it's not as uniformly implemented throughout the United States as, say, the EU system is in the EU, and that governance is a particular problem. Am I summarizing that well, Jim?
I think you're summarizing it well. I honestly can't speak to the inequities of implementation, but certainly agree on the governance side.
So in the fact that some states are like banning such information and some states are openly embracing it, California openly embracing it and helping promote it. So there's certainly not uniform implementation across all states, but where it has been implemented, the standards have been adhered to fairly well, so that if we were to ingest a VCI from California, we are likely to be able to ingest it from many of the other states that have put together that type of information.
Absolutely, and that's a great point, because as they emphasize today, that regardless of whether you're in a red state or a blue state, it doesn't matter in terms of getting your smart health card, because Cerner, I know Epic is on board with it. I've talked to Epic for months, especially in my previous capacity. Cerner was represented there. CVS was represented there. So they were emphasizing whether your particular state has a Department of Health initiative for providing you a smart health card, or you went back to either your Cerner or Epic equipped provider and obtained a smart health card, or you went back to CVS or Walmart where you got your vaccine and obtained a smart health card. So they're really, I mean, as they present, there's really no limit in the US concerning that red state, blue state differentiation as to how the state feels about it. If you live in Florida or Texas and want a smart health card, there are individual rights of access to get that through commercial channels, even if the state DPH does not support it.
Very pertinent to this discussion, that in spite of the lack of state health departments providing uniform access to this, it may be available through commercial sources or through the healthcare systems that are providing the care for patients, either for test results and or vaccinations.
Yeah, especially if they're on Epic, because Epic has been working closely with their user base to make this available in the App Orchard. And I know Kaiser was already moving some months ago for adoption. But I think Mayo was one of the names. So you're talking within the top 10, 15 healthcare systems in the US.
Okay. The next one listed by Good Health Pass is the Digital Infrastructure for Vaccination Open Credentialing, DVOC in India. I don't know anything about this one at all. Anyone have any input on this one?
This is the one that I thought you mentioned before. I don't have much input. I've only had like 2 conversations about DVOC over the last 6 months. And I haven't seen any additional momentum on it. It was funded through Gates, as if I recall, and I guess they consider the implementation successful, but I'm not aware of DVOC representatives actively collaborating or reaching out to participate in the broader conversations with, EU and ICAO and the like. So
okay. Let's go on to the collaborative arrangement for the prevention and management of public health events in civil aviation, CAPSCA. So this is the ICAO solution, and in some collaboration with the WHO. I'm also not well informed on this one. There's a lot of these. There's so many of them that it's difficult to keep up with them all. Any inputs on this? Deafening silence.
I don't have any input on it, but I noticed that IATA is not on the list. I would say, for the sake of the minutes of this meeting, that we keep an eye out on IATA and their momentum relative to CAPSCA, ICAO, the WHO, because I think, at the end of the day, the biggest player wins. And I sense that IATA will have momentum such that they may end up making it the default standard for adoption by virtue of momentum. But that's me prognosticating at this point.
So somewhat tied together are the ICAO, IATA, and CAPSA. Okay.
IATA is not tied together. They are effectively in competition with the other ones.
Okay.
Yeah. ICAO and IATA are covering the same ground or the same sky, if you look at that. So.
Okay. And the Airports Council International and Karen, I'm completely unfamiliar with any success that they've had.
Yeah, I would actually recommend professionally that you take Karen Alliance off the list. That's not a direct fit. Ryan Howells, the director of Caring Alliance, was on the webinar today. Caring Alliance is supporting the VCI Smart Health Cards implementation. Caring Alliance represents the largest collective groups of federated identity solutions for healthcare. I am participating with Ryan in a separate HL7 identity group, entirely separate from this. I have tried to talk to Ryan on numerous occasions about, if you look at one of their last white paper, which was very, very good, they basically kind of downplayed distributed identity management, what we would consider SSI, decentralized identity, as something out there. But of course, there's commercial interests for all of them, and I can say that publicly because I think it's obvious, that they foster and promote federated identity solutions. So this is the Oktas of the world, etc. So as an alliance, their paid memberships are making money on federated solutions and are not advancing decentralized identity solutions in the same way that Hyperledger Diff and TOIP are. But I am approaching the angle, I personally am approaching the angle of, and I would offer, I am basically kind of the lone voice in healthcare IT standards around decentralized identity. I'm approaching the Caring Alliance conversation separately on the broader issue of SSI for that, beyond just vaccination credentials. But they don't have a direct role to play right now, other than their affiliation with VCI in the mix.
Cool. So those are kind of the ecosystems that are out there. I wanted to go over the entire list that was recommended by the Good Health Pass Collaborative, just to have kind of an overview of what's out there. I think it's useful to talk a little bit about in our notes today about what formats that these might come in, and then what does transitive trust look like. If you look down, the Good Health Pass also recommends that we support paper-based solutions and offline credential exchange, and accept the non-W3 type of credentials into the ecosystem. But if we look at kind of a bang for the buck on what we implement versus what benefit would be derived, that's part of the conversation I want to drive. Getting to the support of paper-based credentials is a good goal, but it might not be at the top of the list. And so I want to talk about that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about in zone one. Zone one is the receiving of a health credential. They have zone 1, 2, and 3. And zone 1 is the receiving of a health credential, and 2 and 3 are the further down as you present it to a government and have a pass that you might use further down in the travel ribbon. But the topic of the Good Health Pass recommendation for getting a high quality credential in the first place and robust identity binding to the accuracy of the data that you're getting in that first credential is the topic for next week. And we're going to look at that in greater depth there. But it does have some bearing on the discussion of derivative credentials, because you're relying somewhat on or completely on the identity binding and the issuance of that original health credential that you're going to create a derivative credential from. So that's why I wanted to bring that up as well. But if we go back and look at which organizations we might want to support and in what order, looking at the wide variety of things here and trying to apply the 80-20 rule to get 80% of the benefit from 20% of the work, looking at which ones we should support first, I would like to suggest an order and then have a discussion about it, that we look at supporting the EU certificate first, because that gives us a largest coherent population coverage with the smallest amount of work and provides the greatest level of interoperability. The second one I would like to propose is looking at the VCI certificates in the United States, because again, it gives you the greatest additional coverage for the next amount of work. And then it starts to fragment beyond that, and I really can't see what comes beyond 1 and 2 anyway, because I like to take what I learned from the first one and apply it to the second, third, and fourth. Are there other considerations that might make a different ordering of that instead of largest population with the least amount of work? Are there other considerations that we should take into account in ordering who we might want to look at for our first target for a derivative credential or inclusion?
One possibility, not saying that this is what we should do, but one possibility is we may look at creating derivative credentials for, say, a large group of people that is at risk of a bad solution. So saying there are 300 million people in the United States that are using paper credentials. Let's quickly set up a solution to issue derivatives to save them from themselves.
That is another consideration, to bring in the paper credentials. So paper credentials is another one, the PDFs and ugly forms of highly subject to fraud credentials. So that's
not necessarily, doesn't have to necessarily be paper, but is there some large group that's doing it wrong that we want to rescue?
Instead of looking at people who got it almost right, look at the people who got it really bad.
Yes, maybe something like that. It's
Let's
just
call it areas for improvement. Large areas for improvement.
Large areas for improvement. People who okay, areas. So that's another consideration.
Just another angle to look at it.
Other topics or thoughts on how do we select our first target area?
I'm inclined to say that because the EU has a pretty well defined and established and static thing, that is probably the safest one for us to tackle first, just because based on what Jim was saying, the whole VCI smart health cards thing is kind of up in the air. It's got a couple of gaps, and maybe it's going to lose momentum at some point or evolve, in which case we might want to wait and let that shake out a bit before we tackle it.
If we had infinite resources, we could do all of them at once. But since we don't, it forces us to pick 1 or 2 to start with. And that's the reason for the conversation. I know that the team that has been working on the code base is limited in the amount of time they have. So I want to make sure that the efforts are the most productive we can make them.
And I do like the EU as the first candidate. I just thought I'd make sure that we don't have some strong reason to look at it from another angle.
Okay. I think that it brings us to another topic for how that might be done. So if you have a certificate, if no one has any objections, I think the order can stand as it is for now. And along this line, I think we can take it back with our steering committee and get their advice as well. It's not something that we can start on today, but it's something that we could probably start on soon. And so I want to take our recommendations to the steering committee and make sure that we're keeping them well informed and that they're helping guide the decision as well. But I want to make sure that they know that we discussed it. So next topic is what does that ingestion look like? There's a couple of ways that it could be done. You could, in the Cardea workflow, you have a health verifiable credential that's presented to a government. The government looks at it and says thumbs up or thumbs down. and issues a trusted traveler or does not. Both parts of that system are verifiable credentials. We could put as a pre-step to that, ingesting like an EU certificate and producing a verifiable credential that essentially contains the same amount of information in it, but instead of being signed by the EU originating country, it's signed by the evaluator of that and issued with the same information in it as a verifiable credential. That verifiable credential can then be presented to the government agent, and everything else flows the same as it did, with the only adjustment being that there's now a new source of a derivative health credential that's listed in the governance to say they're an accepted translator of a source credential into a verifiable credential, or a source certificate into a verifiable credential. And then the whole system, the rest of the system flows as it currently stands. Another mechanism is to change the government agent to accept multiple forms of input, such as a EU certificate that is signed instead of a verifiable credential. And then the trusted traveler can then be flow in the same fashion throughout the rest of the ecosystem. Are there thoughts on that? Go ahead, Mike.
So since there could be other parties involved in looking at health credentials besides the government agent, maybe they switch health providers, or there's some other agency with or organization with a legitimate need to know, maybe ingesting the certificates in a translating credential provider, and thereby giving people the option to get their verifiable credential earlier in the process, and then use that for those other use cases besides the government agent, would help protect people's privacy and other use cases earlier in the process. It might be better to have a verifiable credential start earlier.
So as described in a conversation I had with a representative from a member state of the EU, they described that they needed a domestic solution to take their DCC and turn it into a verifiable credential so that they could use it domestically. And there's no government involved in that. It's just, can they translate it into a form that's more privacy preserving for domestic use? So I think that also argues for a translator agent, as it were, that translates from like DCC to verifiable credential. Other thoughts, other mechanisms that could be considered for the methodology for translating, and at what point in the process it should be done?
And so who would it be a sovereign state or other, like pre-approved, one of these pre-approved, like you're allowed to play in the EU ecosystem, that would be then doing that translation?
It could be either. It could be the state itself that says, hey, we've got to, if it's the state itself, then they could directly issue a verifiable credential. If they're not the direct issuer or signer of the certificate, then they may need to say, oh, a healthcare organization provided the DCC and we'll translate that into something local. Also, if you have someone who comes from somebody travels from Germany to Belgium, and now they want to travel within Belgium, there is not a good mechanism. And if there's a translation service, then even though Belgium's not the originator of the health data, they can take a German DCC and convert it to something that is useful within Belgium for domestic use. So I think that there's a strong argument for providing a translator agent the translator agents could be either operated by governments or they could be operated by third parties that are adhering to the rules that the government has determined to allow the translation to occur and therefore become a trusted issuer in their ecosystem. So if there is such a translator service, how is there room in the credentials that we have today for referring back to the original data in our schemas? Have we made sufficient provision for that?
I remember making provision for that. Whether it's sufficient or not may be yet to be determined.
Implementations tend to determine whether or not sufficiency is there. I think that you're right that we plan for it, but when we get into the details of implementation, there might be an adjustment need to be made.
Yeah, and I don't know that at the time that we had drafted the schemas, the DCC credential was totally locked in. I know we compared against Good Health Pass and some others. And we added in the schemas, there is some placeholders, let's say, for the idea that it would be a derived credential. So in theory, it should be fully supportable, but that mapping exercise would certainly unlock the details.
So the mechanisms, I think we've allotted for it in the schema to be able to support a derivative credential and refer back to the original in some way, so that the transparency, if there's a breakdown in a particular credential, that the flow could be taken backwards to say where did the data originate and who signed the original. So if you can point backwards to where the data came from and have signers at both the original credential and signer at the translator, then you have the transitive trust, I think, that needs to be there. This needs to be reflected in the governance. Mike, I don't know if our machine readable governance has the notion of an indirection on the trust to say a verifiable credential that has as a field this original signer, and are they also a trusted person? So the indirection on the machine readable governance, is that supported? I think we need to take a look at that to make sure that we've encapsulated that as well.
Ken, I think we can do that without having cryptographic there. We're already trusting the translator, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we just trust them to accurately indicate who the original signer was, we don't have to cryptographically do that to derive value. So the short answer is that could just be a field that we decide the format of. That could just be an attribute of the credential that we decide the format of. The other thing that I want to mention here
I'm okay with the attribute being an attribute in the credential, but I don't know if the machine readable governance has the capability of looking at an attribute to determine the issuer. Right now it's the signer, right? So that's the point I'm trying to bring out.
Certainly. The other thing that I wanted to highlight was that when we're you mentioned this trust that we need to be able to run it backwards, and one of the opportunities that we have with selective disclosure is that the issued credential can actually contain a hard identifier for the translation or for the original document that came through, so that the translator can correlate it with their records. Obviously, you would not want to disclose that because that's a super correlator, right? That's a unique identifier for that credential that you were given. But in the governance, we can have one schema for the issuance of the credential that contains such an identifier, and other schemas that are approved for presentation that do not include that, which means that the user would be warned if asked for information that included that identifier, and could be advised not to disclose that. And that's one of the advantages we have if we can selectively disclose fields in the credential. Should the user still has it, which means if something escalates and they really do need to present that, there could be in the governance listed authorities where it is advised that they present that. And then now we have kind of the best of the both worlds. We have a credential that can be linked back to an original document very accurately, and we have the ability to not regularly disclose that identifier as part of the same credential.
Thank you. Mike?
So along the lines of tracing back to a source for a certificate, if that's treated as an attribute of the credential, then you would be verifying its the value in that field or in that attribute rather than verifying the issuer of the verifiable credential. So we have the ability to use or generate different presentation definitions where there are rules applied to the value of the field, and that would be treated separately from the machine readable governance that says who are the trusted issuers of verifiable credentials in our ecosystem. So you know, if you create a presentation definition that says this field must contain one of the following trusted sources for, you know, certificates that we're deriving this credential from, then that's a validation you can perform based off of the attribute without having to tie it to the governance of who are the trusted issuers in the system. That kind of,
Well, wouldn't you want to, I mean, this is all configurable, but you might want to do both, because if you're saying only these people are trusted to interpret the DCC credential, then knowing who issued the original DCC credential and who did the translation would be valuable.
well, and it doesn't preclude the notion of having the issuer of the translation listed as a trusted issuer in the ecosystem. It just means that there's basically two tiers of issuers. You have the list of trusted issuers of verifiable credentials, and those are listed in the governance as participants with rules applied, et cetera. And then you have a separate list of issuers of the certificates or the previous standard that's, you know, they're not treated as as an issuer of verifiable credentials in the same way that our translator would be. It's kind of this was the lower tier or something like that.
Second tier of issuance.
Right. So you can say here are trusted sources for the attribute in this field that describes who issued some kind of other certificate or credential system, but we're not treating them as a full-blown issuer because that standard didn't meet the levels of assurance and privacy protection, et cetera, that you need to in order to be an issuer of a verifiable credential. Okay, let's see. I got to look at Sam's notes because he had one other thing he said that I wanted to respond to. Oh, the progressive disclosure. The same thing with, I think our schema had a field for the identifier of the previous record, a record number or certificate ID field or something like that. I think it was already in there. And so the progressive disclosure would be really important on that one. And we have the ability to support different presentation definitions applied to different roles so that certain verifiers would not even be allowed to ask for it if they follow the rules in the governance. And if the mobile agent is looking at the rules in the governance, it would be able to detect an aberration or a departure from the scheme that's supposed to be followed for a particular verifier.
Good.
Whew, a lot to say.
Well, it ties it. The thing I like about the machine readable governance that we're pursuing is that it allows for that flexibility to cover situations like this. We may not have got everything exactly lined up 100%, but I think we're 95% there and maybe need some slight adjustments to accommodate some of these things. But I think that, like I said, implementation does tend to flesh out any gaps that in theory that we put together.
Yeah, I just pulled up the one of the documents on the schemas. I'm not sure that's the latest and greatest, but on the vaccination one, we had the certificate original issuer, the certificate original identifier. So that would be that trust key to translate it back. So yeah, I think that is, there are certainly support for that. We'll have to make sure it's consistent across the lab one as well, but
There
should
are
be
a number of other organizations that could become those translator organizations, either the member states themselves or the trusted people appointed by them, or third parties that offer it as a service, and then by reputation, because of their excellent processes and high attention to privacy and security, might become viable, trusted organizations that are operating outside of direct government or direct government appointed sources. So I think that it allows for interoperability to scale out, and could be a model for how to do it for other systems that we haven't considered yet. So if we target the EU certificate first, the DCC, and are successful there, I think that the work could, I'm hoping that the work would be readily translatable to the VCI solutions that are in somewhat broad adoption in the United States, and then be able to, on a case-by-case basis, start to pick up the long tail of other solutions that are out there to bring them into something that's interoperable. And I think that by providing a translator agent in the ecosystem, that we can then allow for parties that have implemented their own interesting solutions that don't comply with those first two, or the direct verifiable credentials in the beginning, to be able to participate and have their credentials find a mechanism for the use cases that their citizens or travelers might be wanting to use to present them in places that are more broadly interoperable because of the way we implement it. Other considerations that haven't been addressed that need to be. So we've talked about the mechanism. We've talked about target populations of credentials that could be useful. We've talked about the trust and governance models that can help support this. What else should we have talked about that I did not put on the list of topics to talk about? Given the stunning silence, I will assume that we've done a fairly adequate job at our first pass on this to give us some good guidelines here. We'll take it up with the steering committee for approval of kind of the EU first, VCI second, before we move on with actual implementation. But I think this has been a useful discussion. Mike, you had another comment?
Oh, yeah, just the only thing I could think of that we haven't talked about is priority relative to other tasks.
So we still have established priority to chase down the machine readable governance. That's the highest priority that we have, because I think that enables so many of the other things that we're doing. And I think that working on this may come in parallel with internationalization, or internationalization may be eclipsed by this in terms of priority.
I think the other, sorry, go ahead.
I'd vote to have this eclipse internationalization personally, but.
Is that something we want to take to steering?
Yeah.
Okay. I think my question is, what is the sort of next couple of steps that move this topic forward? Is it that we have to get the DCC spec and crosswalk it? Is it that there's some technical review? Like, what do we see as those like couple of next steps?
Next steps, there is a code base, an open sourced code base for how to evaluate a GCC certificate and a DCC certificate. And then if we can take a look at that code base and give a preliminary evaluation of how complicated it would be to do that mapping. So the mapping from the DCC fields attributes to the verifiable credential attributes, and see what's either well aligned or what's missing. And then the evaluation of that code base. And then we need to work on permissions, so that if they've opened it up to everyone, great, then there's no need to go ask for permissions. But if they have not opened it up to everyone, started on the process of getting permission to do evaluations and do at least a trial to prove its feasibility, thereby maybe opening the door to a broader use of it. Those are the 3 steps I see happening. Any other steps that need to be included there? Our next topic for next week is Keela will be leading a discussion. What are you going to be talking about next week, Keela?
We're talking about KYC, know your customer, and how do we tackle that in a digital and sort of mass implementable way. So that's a big challenge, and being able to then link the credential to the identity of that person.
Cool. Is there anything else that needs to be brought up for our group, or topics that we should be adding on to our roadmap for the subsequent weeks?
I think we're good.
I think we're good. I think this concludes this exciting event installment of Clutch Cargo and his friends. Clutch Cargo is a cartoon in the United States from the early 60s. It was a really terrible cartoon, but they did have some awesome adventures. There we go. If there's nothing else, we'll let the meeting go and everybody can get a whole 0 minutes back.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks.
Great, thanks, Ken. Appreciate it.